The FAA has announced some serious penalties for SpaceX following the Starship's maiden test flight, which resulted in massive damage to the launch pad and surrounding area. Debris from the test was reportedly spread for several miles. In today's video, let's talk about these new penalties and what SpaceX can do to avoid them. Will the FAA be forced to ground all SpaceX rockets? Starship is a super heavy lift rocket and spacecraft built to carry immense cargo and numerous astronauts into deep space. The 400-foot-tall stainless steel tower looms over NASA's rocket, the Space Launch System. It would take about 5 billboards stacked on top of the ladder to measure up to Musk's space vehicle. SpaceX estimates its rocket also has about twice as much thrust. The rocket is made of stainless steel, a material Musk is particularly fond of due to its relatively low price. Unlike NASA's Mega Moon rocket, which flies on super-chilled liquid hydrogen and oxygen, this beast is fueled with 10 million pounds of liquid methane and oxygen. The new fuel can be stored at more manageable temperatures than liquid hydrogen, meaning it doesn't need as much insulation and is less prone to leaks, a problem that often stymies NASA launches. Starship is intended to eventually evolve into a fully reusable launch and landing system designed for trips to the Moon, Mars, and other destinations. Its reusability is the holy grail of space, Musk said at a company event in South Texas in February 2022, because it will make spaceflight more affordable to the average person. SpaceX and the Federal Aviation Authority have a tumultuous relationship at best, mainly due to the company's failure to follow proper launch guidelines. Tardiness has also played a role as SpaceX has failed to produce post-flight launch data for the authorities, most notably before launching 53 Starlink satellites from Florida last August. In that instance, the FAA proposed a $175,000 fine to SpaceX for not sharing that data within at least 7 days of its launch. According to the FAA, the missing SpaceX data is critical because it's used to assess the probability of the launch vehicle colliding with one of the thousands of tracked objects orbiting the Earth. The FAA has previously clashed with SpaceX over seemingly reckless launches. In 2021, for example, the SpaceX applied for an FAA waiver, asking for permission to exceed the maximum public risk allowed by federal safety regulations while launching a prototype spacecraft. After the FAA denied the waiver, SpaceX moved forward with the launch anyway, resulting in an investigation and temporary suspension of operations at one of SpaceX's launch sites. In 2021, Musk was publicly critical of the FAA, tweeting that the FAA Space Division had a fundamentally broken regulatory structure and alleging that delays in FAA inspections had delayed launch times. This shaky relationship could be a big factor in deciding the next Starship launch date. The FAA has advised that SpaceX will have to make several corrective measures to its Stage 0 and minimize the environmental impact of the launch. A fully stacked Starship left the ground on April 20th for the first time, and it came to an explosive end high in the Texas sky. With a mighty roar, the first ever integrated Starship rocket soared towards space from SpaceX's Seaside Starbase facility at Boca Chica Beach on South Texas's Gulf Coast at 9:33 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The majestic rocket came to an ugly end as it consumed itself in an orange and white fireball just 4 minutes after launch and 24 miles above the Gulf of Mexico. As maiden voyages go, it was not pretty. The 165-foot-tall Starship upper stage was supposed to separate from the super heavy first stage about 3 minutes after liftoff, but that never happened. The two vehicles remained connected and the stack began to tumble, ultimately exploding or experiencing what SpaceX calls a rapid, unscheduled disassembly. This destruction was intentional, ordered after Starship experienced those problems. The vehicle experienced multiple engine failures during the flight test, lost altitude, and began to tumble. The flight termination system was commanded on both the booster and the ship. But the employees gathered at SpaceX headquarters in Hawthorne, California to watch the launch let out a massive cheer at Starship's demise, celebrating the gains made on its first ever liftoff. The giant vehicle reached a maximum altitude of about 24 miles, according to the data on SpaceX's launch webcast. It was SpaceX's second attempt to launch Starship. An initial try on April 17th ended in a scrub due to a frozen valve. The flight plan on the 20th called for Super Heavy to come back to Earth in the Gulf of Mexico roughly 8 minutes into the flight. The upper stage, meanwhile, was supposed to fire up its 6 Raptors to head up to the final frontier and a planned partial trip around our planet. The goal was to get Starship to a maximum altitude of about 145 miles, then bring it barreling back into Earth's atmosphere for a trial-by-fire re-entry, ending with a hard splashdown in the Pacific Ocean not far from the Hawaiian island of Kauai, about 90 minutes after liftoff. SpaceX wasn't expecting everything to work out, however. New rockets often fail on their first test flight, and Starship is far bolder and more complex than most launchers. Rather, this test was all about gathering data and responding properly to whatever ended up happening, company representatives stressed. In the days since, much virtual ink has been spilled, both applauding the launch and condemning its failure. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson was among the first to congratulate SpaceX. He stated that every great achievement throughout history has demanded some level of calculated risk because, with great risk comes great reward. The rest of the Twitterverse wasn't as sanguine, with many people labeling the test as reckless and rushed. But whether the Starship Explosion was a successful failure, as some have dubbed it, or just a failure period, the causes of the incident still have to be determined. That question must be answered soon if SpaceX hopes to launch another Starship in anywhere close to the few months SpaceX founder and boss Elon Musk promised in a tweet immediately after the aborted flight. Musk's tweet barely had time to go public before the Federal Aviation Administration announced it was temporarily grounding the entire Starship fleet, stating that an anomaly occurred during the ascent and prior to stage separation, resulting in a loss of the vehicle. The statement said that a return to flight of the Starship superheavy vehicle is based on the FAA determining that any system, process, or procedure related to the mishap does not affect public safety. Clearing that FAA hurdle will require SpaceX to take a deep dive into the telemetry that streamed down from the Starship during its brief flight. This much is clear. Of the 33 engines that power the rocket's first stage, flight video reveals that at least 8 failed to fire. In a February 9th static fire test, during which the engines were ignited with the rocket anchored to the ground, 31 of the 33 worked as planned. Elon Musk tweeted that the team turned off one engine just before starting and one stopped itself, so 31 engines fired overall, and these were still enough to reach orbit. That may be true when 31 engines are firing, but not a mere 25. Had the Starship's engines worked as planned last week, the first stage would have separated and fallen back to Earth at the 3-minute point of the flight, leaving 9 engines on the second flight to carry the rest of the spacecraft to space. Instead, it was at that point that the rocket went into an uncontrolled tumble that lasted for a full and harrowing minute. At the end of that minute, the rocket blew up. The loss of the rocket itself was not the only harm done that day. The launch pad suffered serious damage as bowling ball-sized chunks of concrete were broken loose and flung about from the force of the engines that did ignite. As the New York Times, Texas Public Radio, and others reported, in Port Isabel, Texas, a city 6 miles from SpaceX's Boca Chica launch site, buildings shook, at least one window shattered, and a cloud of sandy debris rained down on the residents and their homes. SpaceX is not pretending that solutions to all of the problems that arose on April 20th will come soon, and after-action reports and repairs like the one the company is faced with are typically slow, painstaking affairs. Many are asking, why didn't the Starship separate as planned? Why did a few engines fail on the booster phase? What will be done to mitigate launch area damage on future missions? All good questions, and there are others too. The second stage of the rocket didn't even get a chance to try flying after all, so there is no way of knowing yet if there are design flaws buried within it that will be revealed only on subsequent tests after the problems in the first stage are worked out. And if 25 engines can do the kind of damage they did to Port Isabel, what will happen when the full complement of 33 does successfully light in tandem? Especially since even with just a portion of its engines burning, Starship's April 20th flight still made it the most powerful rocket ever launched. For now, SpaceX is keeping its head down, trying to solve its problems, make its repairs, and satisfy the FAA, which holds the ultimate leash on future Starship flights. There are many who continue to believe the company has the wherewithal to do that, and that Starship has a bright future. While these upgrades may significantly reduce the risk of another mid-air explosion, they still do not solve the environmental impact of these tests. After repeated warnings, a coalition of environmental groups is suing the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, claiming the agency didn't fully analyze the environmental damage that SpaceX's Starship vehicle could cause to sensitive lands. The FAA cleared SpaceX to conduct 20 launches of Starship each year for the next 5 years, notes the lawsuit, which was filed on May 1st in Federal District Court in Washington, D.C. The first of those permitted launches occurred on April 20th from Starbase, SpaceX's site on South Texas's Gulf Coast near Boca Chica Beach. The 394-foot-tall Starship, the biggest and most powerful rocket ever built, performed well on the test flight initially and managed to reach a maximum altitude of 24 miles. But the giant spacecraft suffered several issues that forced SpaceX to command the vehicle's destruction high over the Gulf of Mexico. The explosive test mission sent particulate matter raining down on the surrounding area, notes the lawsuit, which was filed by the Center for Biological Diversity, the American Bird Conservancy, the Surfrider Foundation, Save RGV, and the Carrizo Comcrudo Nation of Texas. The organization went on to stress the environmental importance of the area and the effect of SpaceX's presence is having on the surroundings. SpaceX's Boca Chica launch site is surrounded by state parks, national wildlife refuge lands, and important habitat for imperiled wildlife, including piping plovers, northern Apio-Mado falcons, Gulf Coast jaguarundi, ocelots, and critically endangered sea turtles, the Center for Biological Diversity wrote in a statement. Rocket launches and explosions cause significant harm through increased vehicle traffic and the intense heat, noise, and light pollution from construction and launch activities, the Arizona-based nonprofit added. Rocket explosions spread debris across the surrounding habitat and have caused brush fires. SpaceX's work at Starbase also affects people in the area, according to the lawsuit. For example, Boca Chica Beach is public, but the FAA permit allows SpaceX to close access to it for up to 800 hours per year. Such closures are a hardship for the native Carrizo Comecrudo people, affecting their ability to hold ceremonies in the area, the lawsuit states. The Carrizo Comecrudo people's sacred lands are once again being threatened by imperialist policies that treat our cultural heritage as less valuable than corporate interest, Juan Mancias, tribal chair of the Carrizo Comecrudo Nation of Texas, Inc., said in the same statement. Boca Chica is central to our creation story, Mancias added, but we have been cut off from the land our ancestors lived on for thousands of years due to SpaceX, which is using our ancestral lands as a sacrifice zone for its rockets. The lawsuit calls on the FAA to conduct a full environmental review of SpaceX's Starship activities in South Texas. If you like this video, you may also be interested in this one, which talks about why the Starship blew up during its first test flight. Do you think SpaceX can satisfy the environmental concerns stated in the lawsuit? Please share your views in the comment section below.